Welcome to Podcast 18. We are going to be talking about the European markets today, and we've recently added those to our platforms. We've got a lot of interesting stuff there, and specifically we want to talk about the Dublin market. So stay tuned for Podcast 18. All right, David, welcome to Podcast 18.
Thank you,
Glad to
Michael.
be with you today.
It's good to be with you.
So like I said in the intro, we're going to be talking about Europe. We recently added Europe to our platform from an insight standpoint. So all the capacity, pricing, supply, overview stuff we track for the North American markets,
Yes.
we're now tracking for Europe. So excited about that. So a couple things we want to talk about today is, what drove us to add Europe and some of the market conditions and customer expectations that are driving that. Talk a little bit in high level about each of those markets that we're covering and why, and just again for some people who maybe have very little exposure to Europe, just kind of give them a 50,000 foot view there, and then talk specifically about Dublin today, one of those 5 markets we're tracking, and really talk about what's unique about that market, who are the providers in that market, what are the power conditions or the connectivity conditions, and just general market overview.
Yeah.
So excited for that. So let's just jump in and again talk about what led to Europe. Maybe talk a little bit about when we started tracking them all the way through bringing them on the platform.
Yeah. I think when you think about what's happening in Europe today, it's for us, and this is just for our platform. When we started, what we really wanted to try and do was make sure that we could solve the challenge of tracking the U.S. and Canadian markets well before we expanded into Europe. I think one of the easy things for people to do in what we're doing is to say, hey, we're going to get all these data centers on our platform and we're going to have all this information. And so, when you're in our business, the biggest challenge is how good can you be with the data and how well can we really track the market. So we've spent the last 5 years really working on our craft here to make sure that we can do that well in other places as well. And so we really feel like we're in a position now to do that in Europe. At the same time, if you push the data center hawk story to the side, what's been happening in Europe has been very exciting over the last several years. And the U.S. traditionally is probably 2 to 5 years ahead of some of the other data center markets internationally. And so we're starting to see a lot of the maturity that we saw 2 to 5 years ago in the U.S. start to take place in Europe. It's been taking place in Europe the last couple of years. And so it just makes a lot of sense for us to have those markets on our platform. And we're, excited to be adding those. There are, these are very large, some of them are very large data center markets. We'll talk about them here in a minute. And so it really makes sense for us to do that. And some of our customers, are interested in those markets. And so we want to make sure we can serve them well.
Sure. And when you talk about the maturity of the European market versus U.S., what does that specifically mean? Is it on the construction side? Is it on the leasing side? Is it on the marketing side?
Yeah, there's a number of components to it. I mean, first, in different areas because of, government regulations, because of the way tax incentives work, because of power costs and power fluctuations, how stable is the infrastructure in a market. I mean, all those things can lead to a clear pathway of development or a harder, challenging environment. And so in a lot of those markets, it just takes comfort with data center developments. It takes experience with those. And so I would say that the U.S. over time has and because a lot of those bigger companies are headquartered here, there's really been a focus in the U.S. But that certainly has changed, and there's also been a focus in other markets. But I think as this business becomes more global, and as you think about serving businesses and users all across the world, you can't just do that from one facility in one country. I mean, you have to have a global footprint, and that's what we're seeing both from hyperscale users and from enterprise users as well.
Great. So let's talk about each of those markets.
Yeah.
We're tracking now 5 markets. We feel like the 5 most important markets in Europe, and it's Frankfurt, London, Amsterdam, Paris, frequently called the flap markets,
Yes.
and then Dublin as well. So just give us like a little bit. Start with Frankfurt, and we'll go
Yeah.
just walk down that list and talk about, hey, just give us like a couple minutes, 30 seconds to 90 seconds on that market and what makes it unique.
Yeah, I mean, Frankfurt's interesting in the sense that, you have some very mature data center operators there that have been building for a long time. And, I think the thing that stands out to me with that market is just the growth from some of the larger players, hyperscale players over the last several years. We've really seen that impact the market. But, that from a Frankfurt perspective, that's what stands out to me today. I'll just kind of work through each one.
Sure.
From London, London's standpoint, London's the largest market of the five
Sure.
that we mentioned. And so from a, different types of offerings, retail data center operators, wholesale data center operators, hyperscale data center operators. That is, there are certainly companies there that have invested significantly over the last 5 to 10 years and really have mature footprints in that market. And it's the largest of, as I mentioned, those European markets.
Yeah. So, and as we're walking through these, maybe it would help and put you on the spot here to kind of say like, hey, what's an analogous market in the U.S. for each of these markets? I think that would be
Sure.
help our listeners to put everything into context.
Yeah. And I'm just thinking about this from a size perspective.
Sure.
So every data center market is different and unique, but London would be like the Northern Virginia in the sense that it's the biggest. Now, London certainly doesn't have if you think about how big Northern Virginia is compared to the others, it's a different story. But, Frankfurt and Amsterdam would be almost like, Dallas, Chicago, Silicon Valley, as far from a size standpoint. Amsterdam is really interesting because there's been a lot of growth there. There's been some challenges from a power perspective, and maybe the growth that can take place down the road. But I certainly think that the maturity in that country is taking place and will continue. I think Paris, a smaller market, but interesting discussions have been taking place there, I think, over the last year from both a power cost and tax incentive perspective. There's some legislation that's currently being discussed today that could be interesting for data center users, and so that'll be fun to watch. In 2020, I say this all the time, but like the easiest way to change the way data center development takes place in a market is to change tax incentives, because that can have a direct impact on users that look at that market and want to go there. And then Dublin. Dublin is of those five, Dublin's the smallest, but there's a lot of activity going on. It's one of the reasons we're going to talk about Dublin today. And and there's just been some really interesting growth that's happened both from a hyperscale standpoint and a multi-tenant colocation standpoint, which we'll hit on here a little bit deeper. But that's really a good little description of those five markets and how they, compare to one another. And I am incredibly bullish on what's happening in Europe. At least the conversations that we have with a lot of people, data center users, data center providers, consultants, investors in the space. There is a lot of activity happening in Europe, and 2020, I think, will be one of the biggest years from a absorption development standpoint in those markets.
Yeah, so hopefully that's a helpful primer for folks who are just like maybe have, again, little to no exposure to Europe at all. So let's do a deep dive on Dublin and again talk about, hey, who's there? What does that environment look like? Again, from a power standpoint, from a connectivity standpoint, from a development standpoint.
Yeah.
So let's just go down, hey, just give us like go from 50,000 feet to 10,000 feet as far as, Dublin, what's going on there?
Sure. Yeah. And this is good. I love doing this. This is what we hopefully are able to help people and data center professionals that are in the space, making sure they can really understand what's happening in a market, because it is challenging, it is hard. So hopefully today we can do the 50,000 foot view and then also highlight some of the very key things that are taking place. I think the first thing I would say is as countries become more mature from a data center development standpoint, and that's happening more and more, and I think this is across the world, you see maturity from the infrastructure side of things, connectivity, power, and the more and more countries do this, the more and more mature they get. And I think, there's been some commitments by the power provider there in Dublin to, push towards expanding their their overall renewable mix over the next 5-10 years, and that is certainly a trend. If you're a country, if you're an area, if you're a power provider that is wanting to attract data center development, being able to talk about renewable energy and how your fuel mix is changing over the period of time to attract those users is the way to bring development into your market.
Yeah, and that's really been a two birds with one stone type of deal. So talk about some of the power challenges that existed over the last 5 years that renewable is really solving.
Yeah, I mean, whenever you have big users come to a market, Dublin has certainly had that. I mean, they have had some pretty big opportunities that have come into that market, big users that have taken large amounts of power. It can put a strain on the grid. And so I think that, they've just had to figure out how to best handle big data center users. And so the requirements that come along with that. We talk about in the data center industry, we talk about how 2% of the world's power is used by data centers. And actually, I heard a stat the other day that number has increased, which is not surprising. And so there's more and more exposure being done today on the data center industry. So that's why I think you see power providers like the ones in Dublin that are focused on the renewable side of things. And that basically is taking a barrier away of why companies might not want to come to a city or a market and allowing them to do that. So from a power perspective, certainly that's where the focus is today. From a connectivity standpoint, a lot of times with data center development, you see the development based off of where densely populated areas are or connectivity runs throughout a city. And so Dublin is really, geographically, the development is taking place on the M50 loop in 5 or 6 different areas. And this is another data center trend from a development standpoint is that traditionally when you see data center development taking place in one area, that users or providers will typically cluster together. So there's more than one data center facility or provider in a certain area. So in those 5 or 6 areas, each one has 2 to 3 different users or providers in that area because there's already connectivity there. There's the power that has been distributed to that area can be utilized as well. So that's another thing that we see in that market.
And have you seen like some of the trends we see in the United States, typically a hyperscale buyer will put a flag in a market and some other public ones co-location guys will kind of snap up land kind of around it. Do we see that same trend in Europe or Dublin specifically?
To an extent, yes. Maybe not as big as we do in the U.S., but I certainly think that where those bigger players are going, the co-location operators, data center operators are really looking at how can we serve them because it illustrates the dual strategy that a lot of those data center users have had, which is, hey, we are going to build and own and operate the infrastructure ourselves, but we also need to bring requirements to the market quickly. And there's, even the most sophisticated users can't predict the future. And so when the future changes, you have to have flexibility, and that's what a lot of the data center operators provide to those users. So I think that we've seen some of that. I mean, from a market size perspective, it's the commission power in Dublin is a little over 100 megawatts. Now, this is of the co-location providers in the market. So if you track this market, there's obviously a number of users that own and operate their own space. That is not counted into that amount. So I think that I just want to communicate that. But I think what's really interesting is, we're tracking over 250 megawatts of data center projects by data center providers, that are planned in the future. That's not saying that there's not other large users that might build, own, and operate their own. Again, that would be separate from that 250 megawatt number. But you can definitely see that there's interest in this market, not just for what's been done in the past, but what can be done in the future. And so that's one of the reasons, I'm certainly bullish on Dublin and what's going to happen in the next 2 years.
Yeah, and so before we talk about maybe who are some of the primary players in that market,
yes.
and I think something that maybe your non-data center professional or someone who's not been focused on Europe has heard about is some of the corporate, not data center specific, but just general corporate tax incentives that Ireland has, and it's been folks are moving business over there for a variety of reasons.
Yeah.
But, has any of that trickled down to the data center industry, or are there any specific data center incentives that are shaping that market?
So I would say not like public data center incentives, but I do think that general, tax-friendly environment certainly spurs businesses to want to be there, and that will create data center requirements in a market. And so all that stuff speaks to, the value of companies wanting to be in that market, wanting to grow there.
All right, so let's talk about, hey, who are the main players, that are growing, that are active, or already have a significant amount of capacity in Dublin?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of groups over there that have been there for a while, and that are just starting to grow. I mean, Digital Realty, CyrusOne, Edge Connects, Interaction, Equinix, Echelon, T5 Data Centers, K2, Keppel. I mean, there's a mature group of data center operators in that market that can serve, that have been working with users for a long period of time, and that will continue to. I think, what is most interesting to me in the last couple of years is how there's been a significant investment by large hyperscale companies in the Dublin market. I mean, significant. And, when you see that type of investment by those users, as well as the data center development taking place that is there today and will be tomorrow, I mean, that's just a market that is in a position to grow very quickly. And so, it wouldn't surprise me if we see this market grow significantly over the next 3 to 5 years based off of the market conditions that are there today.
Well, again, David, great insight. Thank you for sharing that. Again, we're excited. You can check out our site, datacenterhawk.com, for more detail on the European markets, Dublin specifically. So check it out. We'll link that in the show notes.
Yes.
And we'll see you next time on Podcast 19.
Yes.